But why would you want to shatter a planet? How do you shatter a planet? A quick recap. In my last video about Bob, the Shatter Planet, I talked about how you could shatter a planet. My overall conclusion was that while shattering a planet could have been an accident or a natural disaster, these options didn't really seem to fit with what we observe in the game. Instead, I felt the shattering was deliberate. My theory is that Bob was shattered into pieces in a series of steps. Firstly, I guessed it was bombarded with asteroids breaking up the surface. Then, I think one or more fusion bombs were used to smash it apart from the inside. These were likely launched from enormous railguns. Then, smaller railguns, similar to the ones we use in the expansion, were used to break Bob into smaller pieces that were usable. In other words, I feel that Bob was shattered on purpose, and I want to explore why that was in this video. Oh, and I'm going to keep calling the shattered planet Bob because it's a lot easier to say. And it amuses me. Why shatter a planet? I'm going to explore 3 core reasons. 1, the planet is a danger to you. 2, you want to kill off its inhabitants with extreme prejudice. And 3, it contains something that you want to get at. A danger. One of the things I talked about in my last video was the concept of a rogue planet. A rogue planet is one that's thrown out of the system it originated in, going on to drift across the galaxy. This would typically happen when there is another large body in the system like our Jupiter, or through interactions with stars. Anything that produces funky gravity effects, basically. In that video, I examined the idea that Bob might have been hit by a rogue planet. But what if Bob was the rogue planet? What if Bob was a threat to another planet, and the inhabitants of that planet destroyed him first? Was Bob native to the Nauvis system? In the last video, I ignored the question of whether Bob was native to the Nauvis system or not. Instead, I focused purely on mechanical aspects of planet shattering. So let's examine that. What's the evidence that Bob is native to the Nauvis system? Well, firstly, it's in the game. If it's not native to the system, then surely it wouldn't be in the game. The distances between stars in real life are enormous, and I'm sure they are in the Factorio universe, where planets are able to orbit closer than they do in real life. So that must mean it's part of the Nauvis solar system, right? Well, no, because in the expansion, our goal, how we win the game, is to reach the solar system edge. And what's left of Bob is beyond that. Of course, what's meant by the solar system edge is a little tricky. Solar systems don't really have a hard edge. Instead, the heliopause, or the extent of the furthest asteroids, are taken to be the edge, but this is usually quite fuzzy. The heliopause is where the star's solar wind balances the radiation from the interstellar medium. But this is not typically spherical, like you might imagine, because the star and the medium are both moving. If you think about the wake from a boat on the ocean, you'll get the idea. The extent of the asteroids is what we call the Oort cloud for our Sun, but with the caveat that we don't actually know if that exists. And obviously, defining it as a hard border isn't going to be easy, since these asteroids will be very thinly spread with strange elliptical orbits. The same definitions are probably true for the star in the Nauvis system, so the edge in the game is effectively arbitrary. But what we know for sure is that the shattered planet is outside of that, and outside by a considerable margin. So it's not really in any doubt. Bob's remains are outside the Nauvis system. One of the things I did think about here is that maybe the edge would change once Bob was destroyed. If the edge is the extent of the furthest object, then that object getting blown up would mean the edge would move in, right? Well, firstly, the heliopause wouldn't change. And besides, if we assume there were no asteroids and Bob was the edge, then at least some of his remains would likely enter the Nauvis star's orbit, and they would then become the new edge. But the fundamental point is that if Bob was the edge, got shattered, and now the edge moves in, why is it now this random distance outside of Aquilo? So I think we have to conclude that Bob was outside of the Nauvis system when it was shattered. But, and here's the crucial point, that doesn't definitively prove it was a rogue heading towards the Nauvis system. The other possibility is that Bob used to be part of the Nauvis system and was thrown out. While I personally think that's unlikely, it does open up even more possibilities for who Bob was a threat to. A danger to whom? The question then is, who would Bob be threatening? We know that there are several other planets in the Nauvis system that all either have life now or had it in the past. Vulcanus has the worms, Nauvis has the biters, and Gleba has the pentapods. But I don't think any of these are likely candidates for shattering Bob, since they're not technologically advanced. The best candidate then would be the Fulgurans, but they're long since extinct. Or are they? I mentioned in my first Fulguran video that the Vault ruins seem like quite a good candidate for somewhere the Fulgurans could be hiding. They could, perhaps, be in some sort of suspended animation, waiting for their planet to recover, or the conditions on one of the other planets to become more hospitable to them. I think it's an interesting and cool idea. Hey, I can like my own ideas, that's allowed. But if they're in hibernation, then they're hardly going to be blowing up planets. But maybe they could have set up some sort of automated defense system to protect themselves, and it's that which detects the danger from Bob and shatters him? Maybe, but there's no other evidence of such a defensive system in the game. And I'd argue that the Engineer is a pretty big existential threat to Fulgura, and this theoretical defense system doesn't seem to have any problems with us being there. Also, how does it manage to shatter the planet, given that I showed the options were pretty limited? I think it'd be better off trying to divert the planet rather than shatter it completely. Not least as shattering it leaves all sorts of debris that could then be problematic in and of itself. The only other planet in the system is Aquilo, which doesn't have any enemies on it. We saw in the Friday Facts that there was an alien plan for Aquilo, this brainy, tentacly, drippy monstrosity that I affectionately dubbed the Gribbly alien, but this was dropped during development. My conclusion here is that an extrasolar rogue Bob would not have been destroyed by any of the native Nauvis inhabitants. That is, if it was a threat to someone in the system, then it wasn't the biters, worms, pentapods, Fulgurans, or the Gribblies. Of course, someone else could have been there. We know that the Engineer was, at the very least. Bob goes rogue. Picking up the other line of thinking about Bob, that it was a threat to someone outside the Nauvis system, then we can also start to broaden our Bob-shattering candidate list. Clearly, a rogue planet is a potential threat to other systems too. So perhaps the Engineer's people detected that Bob was going to be a problem for their home planet. Maybe they therefore decided to head to Nauvis and break Bob up so that it wasn't such a problem. Oh, and I guess we can include the Engineer's people being some sort of space nomads, and Bob was heading for their ships in this particular line of thinking. But that option does point out the big flaw in this theory. If you're a space armada and there's a planet heading towards you, then you just get out of the way, don't you? You absolutely don't try and shatter the planet. As I established in the first video, that takes an enormous amount of planning, energy, resources, and materials. If you're going to try to take any sort of proactive approach, then you're going to try and push it onto a different course. Particularly if you're talking about it heading towards your home planet. Breaking it up seems like the worst thing you could do. You'll end up with a massive debris field with almost uncountable bits that are going to go who knows where. You're literally making the problem a quintillion times worse. Of course, it could have been accidental. Perhaps they didn't intend to destroy it, just push it out of the way. Maybe the Engineer's mission was a disaster and they all got blown up in the process, and we are the only survivor. There's another option here, though. What if Bob didn't originate from Nauvis, but it was going to pass quite close by? Indeed, perhaps it was this close approach to the Nauvis system that was going to send Bob towards the Engineer's home system, a gravitational slingshot style of thing. In this scenario, we can imagine the Engineer's people were using Nauvis more like a convenient place to launch their operations from. Heck, maybe they use some sort of gravity drive to travel these huge distances, and so the proximity to a star is actually part of how they get there. I think this is the explanation that best matches the evidence in the game. Well, assuming Bob being a danger was what got him destroyed, that is. You want to kill off its inhabitants, with extreme prejudice. This theory is fairly obvious to explain, but I don't think it really tracks with what we've been discussing. The concept is that Bob's people and the Engineer's people were at war. To win this war, the Engineer's people decide to completely destroy the Bobians' home planet. As a simple presentation, that has a sort of logic, but it's riddled with problems. Firstly, this theory ignores my first point that Bob was probably not native to the Nauvis system. In this theory, he is. Heck, it's probably better known as the Bob system, and for some reason they've also not exploited all the other planets in their system, but they have decided to do a war with the engineers. Because reasons. Next, if the two are at war, then both must be capable of interstellar travel. So even if the Bobians couldn't avoid their planet being destroyed, they'd surely detect the attack and evacuate. And that's assuming they don't already have a space armada or two. In other words, destroying their planet is very unlikely to eliminate them as a threat. The next problem is the logistics of it all. The engineer being there suggests a mission to go to Bob and destroy it, but that would seem like quite an inefficient way of doing things. Especially since, as I showed in my last video, shattering a planet is not easy. And why is shattering the planet the chosen route? Surely, if you're trying to kill off the inhabitants, you'd focus on making the surface unlivable, or something like that. Poison the atmosphere, block out the light, release viruses and kill all the plants and animals, evaporate the seas. There's lots of ways of making a planet uninhabitable that seem more practical than shattering it. And remember, you're trying to win a war. You just need to render them incapable of fighting or forcing them to surrender, which is a lot lower bar than destroying their whole planet. Of course, it could be somewhere in between. Maybe they weren't really intending to shatter the planet. But there was an accident. Perhaps their FTL drives malfunctioned and slammed into Bob. And this shattered Bob with the engineer as the sole survivor. I haven't really touched on it so far, but this is quite a good candidate for being explained by the biomass engineer theory. Perhaps them taking over the real engineer was the cause of the problem. And the biomass engineer is the only survivor because they're the only one that knew there was a problem. But overall, I don't really like this theory. There's just too many holes and inconsistencies. Dark Forest. There is another version of this theory, where they're not at war, but they are in conflict. The Dark Forest hypothesis is one possible answer to the Fermi paradox. This hypothesis is that there are lots of intelligent species out there, but they're all hostile and they're all silent. But first, I guess I should explain the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox asks the simple question, where is everybody? The point is that the universe and our galaxy are billions of years old, but it only takes a few 100 million years for intelligent life to emerge. Statistically, there should therefore be lots of intelligent species already, but we don't see any evidence of them. Of course, there's lots of possible explanations for this, but in the Dark Forest theory, the answer is that, yes, they are there, but they've all realised that any contact with other species carries too much risk. You have no idea if the species you're contacting will be hostile, and if they are, then you may not be able to defend against them. After all, they could be way more advanced than you. So your only sensible strategy for survival is to stay silent. If you do become advanced enough and develop planet or sun killer weapons, sound familiar, then you might decide to respond with hostility yourself, just in case. It's the first strike principle. Take them out because the risk of them doing the same to you is too great. Anyway, the point here is that the engineer's people could have been one of these silent, hostile species, and they detected the Bobians. They then launched a preemptive strike, and this shattered Bob, and stranded the engineer as a result. While I think this hangs together a bit better, for me, it's still quite flawed. If you're doing preemptive strikes, then sending your people there is a bit of a rubbish way to do it. The attack needs to be a surprise, and a catastrophic one, not sending random engineers to do the job. Remember, the whole point of this theory is that you don't know how dangerous the other species is, so you can't leave any possibility of them surviving or retaliating. And, as per the main conflict theory, if all you do is destroy their planet, then there could be survivors, and that would be bad, as they may retaliate. I mean, you just destroyed their whole planet. They'd probably be a bit miffed, to say the least. Not so hostile. I did also want to touch on a more peaceful option for the engineer being there, which is that it was a first contact mission. Perhaps the Bobians were at a similar tech level to the engineers. The engineers detect a Bobian radio signal and then send a hello first contact mission. As previously suggested, something could then have gone horribly wrong, like the biomass taking over the engineer and their ship crashing into Bob. If it was an FTL ship, then the masses and energies would work. I think this is a more likely theory, but it doesn't really fit the facts about Bob that we established in the rogue planet section. I don't think Bob is native to Nauvis, and if it's a rogue planet, it's very difficult to see how it would support any life at all. No, for me, it's just some big space rock that happened to be passing by, or perhaps heading towards, the Nauvis system. And while I think these other theories are intriguing, I think the thing that none of these theories touch on, Promethium, is the big clue as to why Bob was shattered. It contains a resource that you want to get at. Okay, enough messing about. Let's cut to the chase. Getting at the Promethium is actually why I think Bob was shattered. As I explained in my previous video, and to recap it if you haven't watched it, though you should go do that, my videos are scientifically proven to be good for the soul. Promethium takes its name from the Titan who stole fire, knowledge, from the gods and gave it to man. Promethium is therefore pure knowledge, which is why the engineer can use it to make science number go up. And as per that video, the analogy also works for what we do. Prometheus was punished by Zeus by being tied to a rock and having eagles peck out and eat his liver every day. The liver was where the Greeks thought the human soul lived. His liver then regrows each night, ready for a fresh pecking. We're the eagles, pecking out and eating Bob's delicious livery bits. I therefore think that Bob was shattered to get at the Promethium. Promethium is this rare and exotic material that holds deep secrets about the universe. I want to do a more in-depth video on Promethium, but I think Bob, being a rogue planet, is tied to the formation of the Promethium. The eons spent drifting through the cosmos has turned the core of the planet into this near-mythical science subject. I think that a planet being rogue is the only way this material forms, and it eventually happens to all rogue planets. And that's part of what makes it so precious and rare. Rogue planets are very rare to start with, and the idea of finding this tiny planet in the vast expanses of nothing that is the galaxy are incredibly rare. But who did the shattering? For me, it's the obvious answer, the engineer's people. But there's not a whole lot of evidence to back that up. And what evidence there is circumstantial. I have a whole video coming on why the engineer crashed, but it seems likely the engineer's ship hit something, and I believe that what it hit was a part of Bob. My theory is that they were smashing up Bob and there was an accident or error that destroyed their main ship, and this left the engineer stranded on Nauvis. But as I say, a lot more on that in a dedicated video. Feel free to put your speculations in the comments and see if I agree. Anyway, the point is, I think the engineer's people detected Bob drifting in the void. They were able to do this because they were specifically searching for rogue planets that would have Promethium. Bob was rogue and was either passing by the Nauvis system or had been captured by its gravity and was going into orbit. It may even have ended up crashing into one of the planets. I mean, that could have been the source of the error. The engineers were rushing, trying to get there before that happened. But as I say, there's not much real evidence here. Bob's distance from the edge of the Nauvis solar system suggests to me it's not native, and I think the increasing density of the debris field as you get closer and closer to where Bob was shattered suggests to me it was very recent. If it had happened millennia ago, then I don't think it would look like this. Sure, I could see Bob becoming this huge asteroid belt, but I think if it had been shattered a long time ago, then it would be just that, an asteroid belt. A popular suggestion in my comments is that the Fulgurans shattered Bob. But for me, if it happened a Fulguran civilization scale of time ago, then all these smaller rogue asteroids that we encounter in the inner system would have been cleaned up. What we actually see in the game is an enormous number of asteroids spread right across the Nauvis system. And this spreading is also why I think it's not natural. In the scenarios where Bob is broken apart by a single catastrophic event, such as being hit by another rogue planet, or a fast-moving object such as a ship, then you would expect a debris field that has a direction. That is, the momentum would be conserved. So you would expect a relatively contained field along the direction of travel. Instead, we see this more gradual spreading out. As I said in the last video, it's more consistent with an internal explosion pushing debris out in all directions, rather than being the result of a single big impact. In my scenario then, the fact Bob was close to the Nauvis system is a coincidence, but this was probably convenient for the engineers as it gave them a base of operations. Or perhaps they can only detect rogue planets when they get close to another system, from orbital wobbles for example. Either way, I believe the engineers came to this system to mine Promethium and use it to further their scientific knowledge. But something went wrong, leaving the engineer as the only survivor, and that's where the game picks up. What is Promethium? Well, that was fun. It was a more straightforward analysis this time, and I didn't focus too much on sort of evidence in the game, so I hope you still enjoyed it. And do you agree? Did the engineer's people shatter Bob? And what was the accident that left the engineer alone in the Nauvis system? I'm sure you'll let me know your thoughts in the comments. As a sequel to this, I'm going to explore what Promethium is all about. Interestingly, a couple of viewers pointed out to me that there is actually an element called Promethium. So what do you think? Is the Promethium natural, or did the engineers also make it? How does it actually make the science number go up? If you've got some good theories, maybe I'll chat about those as well. In the meantime, if you'd like to hear more about the shattering of Bob, then there's a link on the screen and in the description below. Look, this is a YouTube channel, so eventually I have to start mining my own viewers for content. That's the law of the land.